Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. And so, wagwan everyone, welcome back to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture. Many of our conversations on Strictly Facts have focused on histories of colonization and independence movements. And I think especially as, currently living in the US, and even as we discussed in our episode on Puerto Rico, it's important to have these discussions on US colonization as well and how it still impacts many of our Caribbean neighbors. So in today's episode, we'll be talking about the political history of the Virgin Islands, especially the USVI, and the effects of American colonization, especially now well into the 21st century. So joining us today, we have Dr. Hadiya Sewer. So Dr. Sewer, thank you so much for joining us. Please tell us a bit about yourself and definitely what inspired your studies in Virgin Islands history.
Hello. Good day, everyone. And also, Alexandria, thanks, of course, for running the Strictly Facts podcast and inviting me to participate and have this, what I'm hoping is going to be a very robust and exciting conversation about American colonialism in the US Virgin Islands. And so I'm from St. John, US Virgin Islands, and it's actually the smallest of the three main islands that makes up this particular US colony. And being born and raised in the Virgin Islands, especially in the aftermath of Caribbean nationalist movements, has really distinctly shaped my passions, a lot of my worldviews, and how I think about what it means to move through the world as someone who is both Black and colonized in the 21st century. And so I really wanted to know a lot of the times, why is it exactly that the Virgin Islands continues to be a US colony today? And, what desires for decolonization might exist in a predominantly Black territory that's been colonized by the United States of America. And so I'm often looking at our experiences, identities, culture, and hopes in the face of being, on the underside of the US empire. And so for people who may not know, there are a lot of environmental justice issues that we face as Virgin Islanders today, but also historically. And so the island of St. John, my home island, is actually over 2/3 national park. And this has raised a lot of questions for us St. Johnians, about the displacement of Black and Indigenous people by white normative models of conservation and colonial frameworks. The largest island in the US Virgin Islands, Saint Croix, is the site of Lime Tree Bay, an oil refinery that was previously known as Havenza that the EPA ordered to shut down earlier this year. And when we kind of couple this with the realization that the early colonial period of Virgin Islands history, the US Navy established a base in the territory, we start to kind of recognize that a lot of our history is really laced with not only colonialism, but also environmental colonialism in particular. And so this has really shaped how I come to think about Blackness, coloniality, ecology. And so I look a lot at environmental injustice in the form of the climate crisis, the coloniality of the Park Service system, as well as the impact of environmental pollution caused by certain industries and American militarism, and how it really comes to shape our political discourses, desires, and conceptions of the human in a profoundly anti-Black world. And so, I'm really passionate about it for many reasons, because it's a life and death question for so many of us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sewer, for being here and for that amazing introduction to our conversation today. And so you gave us a bit of a sort of geographic introduction to the Virgin Islands. So I'm just going to cement us a little bit more. So in addition to St. John, the islands of the US Virgin Islands particularly also include St. Thomas and St. Croix. But there are also, an array of islands that are not only colonized by the US. So you also have Tortola, Virgin Gorda, Anegada, Jost Van Dyke, which all make up the British Virgin Islands, as well as Vieques and Culebra, which are two additional U.S. territories that are part of Puerto Rico. And so I think, especially in terms of colonial histories, particularly amongst the VI, all of the islands in particular, There are varying points where, they're colonized by the Spanish, the Dutch, the British, the French, the Danish, and of course the US. So, how have you seen these histories definitely influencing Virgin Islands culture, political histories, and, possibly even affecting the collaborations amongst the islands themselves?
It's always super important to point out the close ties and relations between the British Virgin Islands, the US Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. I think it's always really cool to be able to say that, like, I can actually see Puerto Rico and the British Virgin Islands from my house and other like key locations in the US Virgin Islands. Sometimes on a really clear day, Tatola is actually so close that historically, Black people were emancipated in the BVI before they were emancipated in the USVI, which was at that time the Danish West Indies. You had a great deal of marriage taking place in the Danish West Indies, where people who resided on St. John would swim to Tatola for freedom. And so, in many ways, we have a very strong history where our migration, our close familial ties, our shared political struggles are deeply intertwined. And so many Virgin Islanders, of course, have immediate ancestry in the BVI and Puerto Rico. And in the Virgin Islands, we also celebrate what we call Virgin Islands Puerto Rican Friendship Day in lieu of Columbus Day. And so we have many informal and formal spaces and networks of collaboration and solidarity. As an illustration of this, I often point out that in the aftermath of Hurricane Irma, part of the way that I was able to evacuate from St. John, US Virgin Islands while pregnant was essentially catching a boat that came over from Puerto Rico to bring supplies and kind of making that journey over to Puerto Rico and taking a plane out perhaps like 48 hours before Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico. And so this relationship that our territories have contribute to our shared identities, our shared, food cultures, as well as just some of our key political figures in the US Virgin Islands have ancestry or their own identity and childhood experiences in Puerto Rico and the BVI. And so many ways, I feel like the colonial borders that imagine us to be separate are very much colonial constructs.
We're separated geographically by bodies of water. I think it's easy for sort of in an imaginatory sense to think, in addition to these colonial lines, there are distinctions, right? And we sometimes less often think of the ways that we definitely work together. So thank you for definitely sharing that and bringing that to light. One other thing that I wanted to talk about, especially as you mentioned these sort of colonial structures in place, is that I think oftentimes when we think of colonization in the Caribbean, it's easy for us to think of British, French, Spanish, and even Dutch imperialism, as we talked about a few episodes ago. However, especially turning to the Virgin Island, the US Virgin Islands in particular, I think we sometimes neglect to mention the Danish influence, or rather the union between Denmark and Norway for colonial expansion. And this was like, especially for the Virgin Islands, a massive history that, was over 250 years. So, in your research and personal experiences, how do you think this critical part of the US Virgin Islands history influences politics and culture today?
I feel like both the United States of America and Denmark are colonial powers, or former colonial powers that aren't always readily identified when we begin to think about conventional or traditional or historical aspects of colonization. And so, in many ways, there's a certain blindness that we often have to the ways in which the US and Denmark deployed colonial power. And so the history of the Danish West Indies, I think, becomes really important to look at both for, Denmark's own reckoning with its historical commitments to white supremacy via slavery and colonization, and also the reckoning that often needs to happen in the US at this moment about what it means for the United States of America to be a colonizer at the current moment. And so the Danish West Indian period of Virgin Islands history is, of course, really critical. Slavery and early settlement takes place during this particular period. And also, the immediate post emancipation era for Danish West Indians also takes place under Danish rule. And so often we think about how we come to understand our Blackness and, in many ways, our Caribbean identities, as well as just some of the pluralistic aspects of our community and our society. A lot of that history can be traced to Danish colonization. And I think that tricky part of our history to grapple with, in part because at moments there's a very strong sense of nostalgia that can be rooted in like dissatisfaction with the current US colonial model of governance. And then also there's the lack of access to a lot of the historical materials and the archives that have shaped so much of our engagement with our history for a very long time. It's actually only very recently, in the last few years, that Denmark digitized the archives that they have on the Danish West Indies, thereby allowing scholars who don't necessarily have the means to travel to engage with the archives on that period in our history. And so we are often a community that has a very difficult time accessing some of the material resources of our past. And so this often comes up in a lot of our conversations, a lot of our advocacy, and a great deal of the discourses that we have about our Danish past. One of the texts that I often kind of refer to often on this particular matter is Jeanette Bastian's Owning Memory, How a Caribbean Community Lost Its Archives and Found Its History. But there are very like critical things that happen in the Danish period of Virgin Islands history. For starters, in 1733, there was we like to call it a revolutionary uprising against slavery that took place in November, whereby the enslaved population and some Maroons resisted against slavery and established, quote unquote, sovereignty or autonomy over the island of St. John in particular for approximately 9 months. This moment is just such a pivotal moment in Black resistance in the Americas. And also, we can start to kind of trace this thread of resistance throughout the Danish West Indian period of our history. And so another example of this, of course, becomes like the uprisings against slavery that led to emancipation in 1848. But also we have what we call 1878 Fire Bun, which was a labor riot. According to our popular memory, it was led by 3 queens, Queen Mary, Queen Agnes, and Queen Matilda. However, research has shown that there was a 4th woman named Susanna, and that there were also men who participated in Fire Bun and were executed as a result of their participation in it. And then we also have coal workers' strikes that took place in the early American period that continues this legacy of resisting slavery, plantation economies, but also just a lot of the forms of exploitation and gendered violence, and also police brutality that we see in the post-emancipation period. And so Fireburn, for example, starts in part as a result of a quote unquote scuffle or a moment of police brutality that took place as individuals on Saint Croix were critiquing the unjust wages that they were receiving for their labor. And so the VI, formerly the Danish West Indies, and that period of Danish West Indian history in particular is such a pivotal but often overlooked moment and location for grappling with questions of like racial capitalism and labor advocacy, especially labor advocacy that are led by Black women and Black non-binary people.
Thank you so much for bringing Bun up. As you said, it's definitely a part of Caribbean history that is sometimes overlooked. It's definitely part of, at least in my experience, is one of those things that I've heard about, through sort of oral storytelling traditions more so, and potentially less so in, history books of a sense. So definitely thank you so much for bringing up and allowing us to honor that memory and that history. And so in following up that question, I definitely want to take us to talking about US colonization in the Virgin Islands, especially because, there were a few attempts in a sense. I think the US has had interest in colonization of the Virgin Islands since, at least in my research, 1867, but I'm sure long before then. And so they formally took control on March 31st, 1917, through the Treaty of the Danish West Indies. My question here then was, what was that sort of local reception to this change in 1917 and moving forward, especially, into that first half of the 20th century, especially when other Caribbean islands were, that was sort of a stark time period for their own independence movements?
Yeah, I think that this is also like such a great question, in part because there are so many conversations that are to be had about the transfer, as we call it, in the Virgin Islands, and what that might have meant for the community, but also for conceptions of sovereignty or even just freedom and justice at that particular time. A point that we often forget, but is worth highlighting: the islands that make up what we now understand to be the US Virgin Islands were actually occupied by like seven colonial powers throughout the course of the territory's history. And so while Denmark was the longest colonizer prior to the United States of America, it certainly isn't the territory's only colonial power. And so the islands in the US Virgin Islands, and namely Saint Croix, flew under Spain, Britain, the Knights of Malta, France, Holland, Denmark, and now the United States. And so the transfer, or the annexation of the Virgin Islands by the US from Denmark, occurred as a result of a $25 million purchase. The treaty was signed in 1916, and the official transfer, of course, as you mentioned, took place on March 31st, 1917, in St. Thomas and St. Croix. Because St. John is so small and isolated, we actually got a belated, quote unquote, transfer day, as one of our local historians, David Knight Sr., points out. The reception at that time, there was not actually a great deal of consensus. You had Virgin Islanders, some of whom perhaps were belonging to like the elite classes in particular, who felt like there might be greater possibilities for the people of the territory under the US flag. Of course, were a lot of critical conversations about the transfer. The US was interested for military purposes and, its own imperial ambitions and concerns that other European powers might develop a stronghold if they were able to purchase the territory. However, Denmark had its own reasons for selling the Danish West Indies. Some of those reasons, of course, include a decline in the economy. And our understanding is that the uprisings that were taking place during the Danish West Indian period contributed to the lack of profitability of the colony. And so there were some who believed that a transfer to the United States of America could help to improve the economy as well as like the models of governance. However, you also had a subset of the population who believed very firmly that the US would bring its models of racism to the newly acquired territory. And so in the early period of American occupation of the US Virgin Islands, this proves to be absolutely true. Virgin Islanders do not receive American citizenship for the first decade of occupation. And then also, in addition to that, the US Navy instituted a naval administration in the US Virgin Islands. In the early period, we see a lot of tension between this predominantly Afro-Caribbean population and the naval administrators, as well as the members of the Navy who were quote unquote left to patrol, the streets of the Virgin Islands. And so, in many ways, the formal history of the Virgin Islands, you see a lot of discussion about this, in part because, the racial classification system in most parts of, the Caribbean and Latin America, somewhat different from a binary racial classification system such as the US's, where you're black or white. And so a great deal of what we see happening during that period is you had a population of Virgin Islanders who, under the Danish period, were considered to be mixed race, were ushered into being identified as Black and therefore being stripped of some of the expectations that they had around the privileges that they had accumulated with their racial identity under the Danish flag. The brutality of this kind of abrupt introduction to American racism led to rolling outcries over the decades, really, and a push for justice, for civil rights, for greater sense of autonomy. And so in the Virgin Islands, eventually they abolished the Colonial Council and established the Organic Act in the 30s and then the revised Organic Act in the 1950s to essentially try to increase self-governance in the territory. And I think it's always really beautiful and fun to remember that at this moment, activists in the Virgin Islands, Rachel Francis, David Hamilton Jackson, they were all and often in conversation with their counterparts in the contiguous United States and also in Europe. And so they were very much linked in to Black transnational movements for freedom, for civil rights. And at one point, W.B. Du Bois even comes to the Virgin Islands and gives a speech at the St. Thomas Chamber of Commerce, where he asks really just like poignant questions about, why, for what purpose, does the Virgin Islands exist, and whether it would continue to be a space that benefits or profits white American and European business people, or whether it could actually be transformed into a space that allows the average quote unquote Virgin Islander to have a good quality of life and a sense of self-determination and dignity. To wrap that all back together, there are disparate reactions to the initial phases of US occupation.
I mean, I guess to sort of push us a bit further, now we're, over 100 years since Transfer Day, which is the national holiday celebrating this transfer from Danish to US occupation. And so I guess my question then is, what has the last 104-ish plus, years looked like? And what was the reception or the reflections over the last 100 years under US rule?
Transfer Day was such a contentious quote unquote holiday, especially in 2017, which was, the centennial year, the 100th year under the US flag. In part, there were many heated debates about how we should even regard Transfer Day and the centennial in particular. Is this a moment of celebration? Is it just an observation? Are we commemorating something? Should we be mourning something? I think that it was very difficult at that time also to even come to a question of how do we collectively regard the last 100 years under US empire. And I think what became really interesting about just some of the ways that we reflected on our political status in that moment is in some aspects of our discourses, you start to kind of hear a certain nostalgia for the Danish period. People reflecting or asking, pertinent questions about whether Denmark might have been a quote unquote better colonizer than the United States of America. Two, we also start to realize that there's like a dearth of scholarship on the Virgin Islands under the American colonial period, right? So we certainly have certain political scientists and historians in particular who have written texts here and there, but we don't actually have robust, wide sweeping critical attention to the impact of American colonialism on our history, our culture, our identity, our politics, or even like our environmental issues. And so, in many ways, sometimes it feels like we're kind of feeling around, gathering bits and pieces of data or evidence or oral histories to make sense of our current location in the world. And so that made the transfer centennial a somewhat hesitant holiday. I tried to unpack that hesitation or that like colonial aporia, so to speak. I think many Virgin Islanders are aware of some of the perceived benefits of being associated with the United States of America, specifically, the US passport, a certain capacity to have some of the resources, especially in the face of disaster, the expectation of federal aid, and so on. And I think that these forms of security or the illusion of security, or even just the privilege of Americanness, is something that really weighs heavily on our psyche. I think that this, of course, is coupled with a great deal of discontent. And that discontent being the realization that, 2017 was also the year that Hurricane Irma Maria hit the Virgin Islands within like a 30-day period. And also, there are a lot of big challenges that the Virgin Islands is facing. We have, of course, like a fiscal crisis. We too have a debt crisis. We also have many challenges as it relates to energy and need to have like more robust conversations about like what environmental justice and energy justice in particular might look like, because we experience rolling power outages. Our homicide rate is also incredibly high. Our infrastructure deals with a lot of challenges. There is a growing realization that unfortunately, all the benefits of empire, of course, have their limits, and that we are truly, in a colony, and we do not have all of the benefits that come with full access to American citizenry, or even the full benefits that come with being regarded as human in this particular world. Tiffany Anik wrote a essay in the New York Times after the hurricanes hit called Americans in a Battered Paradise, where she really reflected on the question that many Virgin Islanders were asking at the moment of disaster, which essentially is, well, what kind of Americans are we? In realizing that we can't vote for the president of the United States, we have a non-voting, representative in Congress, we're dealing with multiple crises. How then do we decide or make decisions about how we would like to move forward? How do we relate to the United States of America as a colonial power? And how do we make sense of ourselves in relation to like the wider Caribbean, where also so many of us have close ties, family linkages, and so on? This question of the transfer day and what it would mean to us is a really big question, and one that in some ways deserves continued attention and reflection.
I think, particularly in our episode on Puerto Rico with Nina Vasquez, Nina talked to us about some of those challenges of being under US domination, right? And how it has even challenged regional collaborations with other Caribbean islands. So thank you for sharing, that the juxtaposition between what it means to formally be under US occupation, but still, challenging people's livelihoods and existences and overall understandings of self when it comes to what it means to quote unquote be an American. But one thing I did want to bring up that I thought from your answer just a moment ago was this question of, whether the Virgin Islands was under quote unquote better rule under Danish versus US occupation. And I think in somewhat different cases, I think that's a question that I've heard across varying islands, depending on their histories, whether, say Jamaica or another island was better when they were colonized versus now being independent. It's a complicated question to answer. But I think in the case of the US Virgin Islands, my question then is, how do you think that necessarily would change, or how does that sort of bring up questions of independence movement activism, because in a sort of sense, there hasn't been the sort of immense network of independence activism, I think, in the same way. So could you talk to us a bit about how you see that maybe lack of history there affecting the US Virgin Islands and potentially, what that could bring about for the islands moving forward?
Often, when we talk about the Virgin Islands, I think sometimes it becomes really important to recognize and acknowledge all of the ways in which our popular consciousness doesn't fully regard the territory as a colony. I often like to build on Eduardo Bonilla Silva's racism without racist theorizing around, colorblind racism to think through like what I call colonialism without colonizers and just some of the ways in which the refusal to see the United States of America as a colonial power, how it shapes our capacity to understand what it means to be colonized or colonized, and also just how it shapes our capacity to identify all aspects of US colonialism, if not, to desire decolonization fully. In the Virgin Islands, we do not have a robust independence movement. And I think that many of our political discourses around political status are not as fully developed as they are in Puerto Rico, for example. And so our political parties, our popular conversations aren't always organized around the question of whether we want to decolonize by way of, statehood, independence, free association, or maintaining the colonial status quo. Because of this blindness towards the colonial apparatus, I think a part of what happens is that we blame ourselves so much for the problems that we see in our society, whether it be WAPA, our energy crisis, the climate crisis, corruption in the government, and we don't often situate these crises in the long area of colonialism. With that being said, I think a lot of our political discourse revolves around the notion that independence and decolonization aren't necessarily possible for us. We have firmly planted it into the realm of impossibility, at least collectively speaking. So much of our political organizing is often oriented towards, well, how might we incrementally increase autonomy, or how might we try to get some modicum of justice under the status quo? And then at other times, then resignation to the status quo as is. And I think a lot of the hesitation to take on the question of political status and self determination is very much grounded in a certain level of fear, but also a certain realization and looking out at the world that quote unquote decolonization really led to like the emergence of like neocolonialism, and therefore recognizing that the options that we have as it relates to political status aren't necessarily aligned with our greatest, desires for freedom, for justice, for some sense of equality, or for a government where we feel adequately represented. And so I think a lot of like Yarmar Bonilla's writing in this particular vein, because I think that the way that Bonilla theorizes non-sovereign futures, and specifically in that text in French Caribbean in the wake of disenchantment, is also, very reminiscent of how we think of non-sovereignty in the US Virgin Islands in so many ways, when freedom as you desire it or decolonization as you believe in it seems incredibly impossible or out of reach in a world order predicated on multiple structures of violence, then you start to make do in a certain way and you try to survive the day to day. And that survival often leaves one feeling that amenability to power as it stands has a bit more efficacy if you can get some incremental change than the possibility of an outright revolution. And so I think there's a lot of anxiety in the Virgin Islands that many people have around not necessarily having full access to the human or the quote unquote first world or all of these terms that in some ways are problematic. I believe very strongly actually in independence. And I think that so much of the work that we do as perhaps like the small percentage of Virgin Islanders who might believe strongly in independence is about trying to hold open the possibility for futures that seem impossible under the prevailing order. And I think, like, perhaps something that we don't talk enough about is the Fountain Valley massacre that took place in 1972 on Saint Croix on the Fountain Valley golf course. And it left 8 individuals dead. And in many ways, it is a key moment in the history of the Virgin Islands that is oft overlooked, but really fundamentally shapes our political consciousness as it relates to questions of sovereignty. And in many ways, that moment rendered a lot of conversations around independence in the Virgin Islands taboo. The Fountain Valley Massacre ushered in a period of intense American surveillance and policing, and the individuals that they caught and incarcerated for it, some of them claim that they didn't do it. I, from this particular vantage point in history, have no way of knowing for certain what took place or what didn't. But what always becomes interesting to me is that many of them identified as pro-independence Virgin Islanders, and in some ways articulate being quote unquote framed for the Fountain Valley massacre as being a form of backlash for their political ideologies and organizing. And I feel like this is a moment that we don't talk about enough, in part because whether they committed the crime or not, I think that it becomes very important to grapple with what the Fountain Valley Massacre did to our collective political consciousness. And one thing I think becomes increasingly clear, but it's after the 1972 Fountain Valley Massacre that the conversation of political status in the Virgin Islands becomes incredibly taboo. And so being able to put these conversations back on the table or attempting to do so also it raises like a great deal of anxieties and fear about the possible violence that is welcomed to communities who take on those forms of resistance and struggles, but also the long economic impact of it.
Thank you so much. I think this is probably one of the most expansive introductions, at least to understanding US Virgin Islands histories that I've ever had. So thank you so much, Dr. Sewer, for sharing with us. So, for my final favorite question of every episode, what are some of your favorite examples of this long history of the Virgin Islands in popular culture?
Yeah, I really love this question actually. And so I really appreciate your asking me to think about like my favorite like creative works and how coloniality is really examined in popular culture. And I wanted to say like it's so hard to cite my favorites in part because I'm probably like a little bit biased, meaning that like I'm a part of a Black feminist collaborative working group comprised of scholars, artists, and writers called the Virgin Islands Studies Collective. And my fellow founding members, Lavon Bell, Tiffany Anique, Dr. Tammy Navarro, each produce work on the Virgin Islands that really helps to illustrate like the VI colonial condition in very compelling and comprehensive ways. And so if I had to like name a like favorite poem, for example, I often return back to Tiffany Anique's poem titled Lassie Nation. And I think about it quite often. And it's a part of her poetry collection titled Wife. And there are like a couple short lines in it here that I want to recite. And it goes, and I'm not starting from the beginning, I'm actually starting hilariously from like in the middle of a line. But, quote, my soul doesn't care about nations. My soul makes its country in the backyard or bedroom of wherever I carry it. My islands do not make a nation, yet my soul guards their bodies, their waters. That then is the nation. Yes, the pink pit does bear the possibility of nations, end quote. And I have really love Last Nation, but also the Virgin Islands Wedding Verse, which is another poem by Tiffany, because so much of like the affect of how we really just grapple with or move through the day to day or the quotidian aspects of being colonized in a moment that for many is considered, quote unquote, post colonial, is just really rooted in just some of the questions of like desire, but also like ontological questions and even at moments metaphysical questions about, what is it that our soul cares about exactly? And how then do we reckon with our islands, not making a nation and recognizing the aspects of us that guards their bodies and their waters despite nationhood? There are these, moments in VI popular culture and in VI art where we really take on the question of the colonial condition, and I think that Tiffany Unique's poem really points me to this.
Wayago. Stay tuned for Strictly Fact Sounds, where we connect our history to pop culture. Dr. Sewer offered us such amazing literary recommendations, so naturally I had to come with some music. One of the most popular folk traditions in the U.S. Virgin Islands is of the Quelbe, folk music made by scratch bands, or bands which originally made music from everyday objects. One of the Virgin Islands' most renowned scratch bands, Stanley and the 10 Sleepless Nights, has two of many songs that reflect the island's history of revolution against colonialism and foreign imperialism. Hailing from Saint Croix, the band's rendition of song Queen Mary commemorates the actions of Mary Thomas, otherwise known as Queen Mary, who was one of the three integral female leaders in the 1878 fire bun labor protest. Also, take a moment to listen to their song La Biga Carousel, which calls for all to protest working for the 20th century business because the owner refused to increase laborers' wages. Isn't it amazing how so much of our history and radical spirit of our ancestors lives on today in our music? Check out the blog on our website to listen and learn more. Thank you so much for sharing. I haven't checked out those two poems, but I have read some of Unique's work, and so I'll be excited to dive in, and I hope our listeners are as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Sewer, for sharing so much with us today. I definitely learned a lot. I hope our listeners did too. Please let everybody know where they could find you and your work online.
Yeah, Alexandria, thanks so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure to join you here today. Thanks so much for doing the work that you're doing here on the Strictly Facts podcast. I think that it's always beautiful to make space for conversations about Caribbean history and culture. And also, it's like always a pleasure to be able to talk about the US Virgin Islands, especially because I think that so much of our experience is often like invisibilized. And so I'm always grateful for an opportunity to be able to chat about what we got going on, quote unquote, in the US Virgin Islands. And so if you are looking for me online, you can find my work at www.stjanco.org. And it's STJANCO in particular, because we actually use the Danish spelling for St. John when we came up with the name of the organization.
Thank you so much. Of course, as always, we'll have links to all of the different places to find you in our show notes. Listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode. Dr. Sewer, thank you again so very much. And we hope you all have a great rest of your day. Little more. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook, and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.